This is the Building Energy Performance Standard Task Force meeting for April 14th, 2020, starting at 2:30 p.m. This meeting is being recorded and will be posted to the DOE website.
Share the screen. Right. Hold on. Let me get to the slide.
Let's get started here. Welcome, everyone. So, as we said, the meeting's being recorded. It'll be on our website. The way this will work is that task force members are unmuted, and please do mute yourself if you're not talking and there's any background noise to avoid background noise. Non-task force members are muted. Please use the chat box, which is on your right, and we'll go through in a second how to do that, to request to talk, and Darren will see your message and relay your message or chime you in. We're going to do a roll call for attendance of all task force members, and then non-task force members, again, you can use the chat box to register your name, organization, and email. You just say, you just send a chat with that information.
Okay, so this is Sharon.
Sharon, can you talk through how this is going to work then?
Yep, we're going to do a roll call for the task force members to do the attendance. So I'll say your name and you can just say here. So if you'd like to go ahead and take yourself off of mute, so we don't have any delay in doing that particular thing, and then we will get started. Katie Bergfeld?
Here.
Patty Boyd?
Patty here.
Jen Croft?
Here.
Marshall Dewar-Balkins?
Here.
Wendell Felder? Asa Foss?
Yep.
Dave Good?
Here.
Max Greninger?
Here.
Adrian Gross?
Here.
Resh Mahala?
Here.
Jessica Jones?
Here.
Annika Landrino? Cliff Majerzik?
Here.
Todd Nedwick?
Here.
Matt Prasky?
Here.
Joe Riley?
Here.
Jay Wilson?
Here.
Awesome. And then if everybody else, as you can see, folks are in the chat box writing down their name, their email, who they're with, that kind of thing, so we can kind of keep track. If you haven't been to a meeting before, please include your email so we can add you to our newsletter list, and we will keep track of who attended the meeting today. One of the points that I'd like to add for this is we're about to go through some voting on some things that we went over on the last task force meeting. And because we're lucky enough that we don't have any duplicate names on the task force members, at least for first names, that I may just say first names. We actually have to do roll call voting for the recording on all of the votes. And so we'll try and speed that up a little, and I'll just say your first name. So when we get to that portion of it, we'll actually probably have you all stay off of mute so we can kind of zip through that. And I'll do that in the same order that I just did. It's in order by your alphabetical by your last name. But I'm only going to say your first name so we can kind of zip through those. Marshall, I'll turn it back over to you, and we'll go to the next slide. Oh, actually, I won't turn it back over to you because I'm going to do a quick review of Blue Jeans for those folks on the line that haven't been in a Blue Jeans meeting before. So what's on the slide is just a review of all of the controls for the online meeting. So up at the top of the bar, if you hover your mouse over near the top of the screen, you've got your camera button. Then the little microphone is your audio control. If you are having problems with your computer control, you can click on this little down arrow that's right next to the microphone, and it will let you switch to the phone. So I encourage you to do that in case you're having broadband issues. The screen button right next to it is if anybody wanted to share their screen, which I'm doing right now, so please don't hit that button. The red button is where you hang up and leave the meeting, which we'll all do at the end. On the right-hand side is your sidebar that has the list of people. So if you click on the people button, it will tell you who all is logged in. If you click on the chat button, that is where the chat box is going to be. And one thing I wanted to point out on the chat box is that you can either chat to everyone, and I have a little picture of this down here in the bottom with the blue everyone kind of circled. If the blue everyone is circled, that means what you type in is going to go to everyone. If you click on direct messages, you can actually choose one particular person to be able to send a message to. And then if you are having problems, let's say with your audio or your microphone or your speakers and you're having feedback problems, the settings button might be where you want to look and make sure that your microphone and speaker are set properly. And that's on the very right-hand side. So just to get everybody familiar with the controls. If you have any questions, you can always throw me a message in the chat box, and you can send it directly to me or send it to everybody, and we can help you troubleshoot that behind the scenes. So Marshall, I'll turn it back over to you.
Sure. So this is the agenda that we're going to go through in today's meeting. There's a couple small changes from what was originally posted to the DC Register. So I'll go through this. We'll start out with administrative items, which we're currently doing. We're then going to vote on a number of items. Previous meeting, 7 items, in fact, the most votes we've ever had, which is a sign we're really making some progress here. At least I hope so. And then we were going to talk about tradable allowances, but we think that will really be discussion will be better informed by getting a briefing from the Stormwater Credit Trading Program at DOE, and they were not available this week, so we've moved that conversation to the 28th. And we're also moving forward in time the higher education hospital carve-out. I'll let Katie talk to that for a moment longer.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Marshall. So basically we had been, we were really planning to move forward with discussing the campus carve-out, as we're calling it. So it's the provision in the law that basically allows or requires that we create a special campus metric for higher education institutions as well as hospitals. So we were planning to move forward with discussing this with the task force, but the consortium reached out to us recently, and they requested some technical assistance from our team. So they asked us for some technical assistance to help them sort of work out some things that they're trying to think through. And we think that we can probably work with them and deliver and find a resolution quickly on some of the things that they're getting a little caught up on, and kind of help them form their recommendations and make stronger recommendations from their side to the task force. And so we basically have decided to kind of table that discussion until until a future meeting, until we have a little bit more feedback with them and we've been able to work with them on their questions that they have in regards to the technical assistance. So I apologize that we had to take that off, that we took that off the agenda last minute, but if anybody has any questions about that, please feel free to reach out to me, or we can open up the floor right now if anybody has questions about that as well.
Are there any further questions about the higher education carve-out and the schedule changes? Hearing no questions, I'm going to assume there are no questions. I was taught once when you're teaching, you always give people an awkwardly long amount of time. So I think that was, I was like, maybe we'll have questions, maybe we won't. We don't. But certainly if you do have questions, reach out to Katie. I know I had several before this meeting, which I emailed late last night. So very good. I'm looking forward to getting back to that conversation at a later date. And then the other items we will be talking about today after voting is we'll talk more about the standard target pathway. We'll talk about extended alternative compliance path for deep retrofits and talk about what is a deep retrofit and how that might work. And then there's a number of bike rack items that do affect the rulemaking that we thought it would be good to consider, especially in light of the changes to the agenda. So we'll be going through, I believe, 4 of those items afterwards. So, and then we'll have time for announcements. That's it. Moving on. Again, just to remind everyone, the role of the task force according to the legislation, we're here to advise DOE on the creation of an implementation plan for the Building Energy Performance Program, recommending amendments to proposed regulations issuing by DOE, and also in this place sort of helping shape the regulations, hopefully, so that they come out in need of somewhat less amendments to start with, and then recommending any complementary programs or policies. When we have had issues in the past that required really in-depth discussion, and were maybe of particular interest to a subgroup, we have people can suggest moving forward things to a subcommittee. We've done that with several things, including some that we'll be voting on today. And this is an open meeting, so everyone can participate. As we said, non-task force members are muted, but you can put your comments in the chat to Sharon, and they will be shared with everybody.
Proceed yet? Okay. Because for lots of different reasons, sure, in addition to managing accounts. So
someone is muted. Someone needs to mute themselves. Who's not?
No, I just want to know as many of the variables I can get my arm around.
Jules, I'm calling you out.
Jules, yeah. Jules,
I muted. Sorry.
Thank you. Thank you. I think Jules' variables that she's getting her arms around are probably very interesting, but maybe not for the meeting today. So said with love. Let's move on. Meeting schedule. We've talked about so many things that we're having to make the font smaller and smaller. So I won't review everything we've done, but just again, we talked about the things we're talking about today. The goal for the meeting after this will be tradable allowances, talking about penalties, and perhaps presenting a draft outline of what the rules are going to look like. And on May 12th, we'll continue penalties potentially, and potentially can return to the higher education carve-out. And that's the schedule we have right now. So next slide.
Yeah, and Marshall, just can I add to that?
Yes,
quickly?
please.
Yeah. So I wanted to add that I kind of threw this in the last meeting, but I did want to confirm with everybody. So we have received pre-clearance on drafting the rules, and so what that means is that we have like official approval to start preparing a draft of the rules. So we've received that approval. We've already kind of, as you know, we've kind of started coming up with an outline and sort of started drafting a little bit of what the rules would look like. So I just want to let everyone know that has happened. So we received that pre-clearance. Our schedule has adjusted a little bit from what we were originally planning, just because everything's been so crazy this month, I think, for everybody. But we are still planning to move the rules forward as soon as possible. So once we have, we're in a good place where we feel like you all are kind of on board with where we are, we will, continue on with that process. And so that's kind of shifted from early to mid-April more to mid-May. As you can see from here, we still have some discussions we're going to have with you all in May, and then hopefully after that, as long as everything kind of looks good from everybody's side of things, we will move them forward farther in the process, and hopefully get a draft out. Still, we're looking to get a draft officially published sometime this summer so that we can have the rules finalized by the end of the year. So I just want to assure everybody that we're still on track to get the rules out, hopefully well before the end of the year. But when I say well, I mean maybe 2 or 3 months before the end of the year, because as anybody on the phone right now has been involved in the rulemaking process, it can take time. So we are hoping to still meet that timeline as it stands. So I wanted to put that out there, and then also if anybody has questions about that, please feel free to ask them.
Yeah. Any other questions about that? I'll just say, while it may seem that things are taking longer now, in my experience with rulemaking when I was at DC, is that the most time-consuming thing is when you have to revise the rules and re-put out new versions once or twice, or God forbid, 3 times. So, I think this is all the work we're doing here is time well spent. Before we move on to voting, are there any other administrative items that need to be discussed? Hearing nothing, let's proceed to have some votes. So the way we're going to do this is I'm just going to summarize what the vote is. We can have an open discussion to if people have comments to make, and then or amendments to propose to the vote, and then we'll take a vote. And again, the vote will be done by roll call. So vote 1. This is following up on what we talked about last week with the occupancy threshold. Again, this is the recommendation. The recommendation would be to set the occupancy threshold for property types the same level as what EPA recommends for getting Energy Star certified. That means office, banks, courthouses, and financial centers must be at least 55% occupied. Hotels must be 60%. Multifamily buildings must be 80%. So a building of those types that had an occupancy percentage less than that for a defined period of time would be eligible to apply for an exemption, as we'll talk about in a moment. Then for building types that can receive a score but do not have a specific threshold for occupancy, such as a house of worship or a school, the occupancy threshold will be set by EPA criteria for receiving a score. So for example, a K through 12 school is occupied if it's in use for, I believe, 9 or 10 months of the year. And there's guidance on the EPA website for each of those things. Anything that does not get a score and where there's no EPA recommendations, the occupancy threshold will be set at 50%. So that's the recommendations. And again, this does not affect the threshold for what we would call vacancy, for whether or not something has to report data to DOE for benchmarking. This is simply the threshold for whether or not something would be subject to be eligible to get an exemption or an extension on the building performance standard. Any questions or comments or edits before we move to a vote on this? Would someone like to move that we vote?
I'll make a motion to vote.
Do we have a second?
Second.
Cool.
Joe.
Let's do it.
Who was the motion to vote and who was the second?
Katie Bergfeld was the motion.
Joe second.
Okay, thank you. Just, yeah, if when we do the motions in the seconds, if you could say who your name first for recording purposes, that would be very helpful for us.
Sure.
Okay, so we're ready to vote?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so if all of the task force members could go ahead and go off mute and try and keep background noise down. I'm going to go through your first names. And if you would say, instead of saying yay or nay, because I may not hear that clearly over the line, if you could say yes for I support the recommendation, or no for no, I don't support the recommendation, or you abstain. So if the options are yes, no, or abstain, then I'll be able to very clearly understand what you're trying to say. That would be very helpful for all of these. So Katie?
Yes, I support the recommendations.
Patty?
Yes, I support the recommendation.
Jen?
Yes, I support them.
Marshall?
Yes.
Asa?
Yes.
Dave?
Yes.
Max?
Yes.
Adrian?
Yes.
Reshma?
Yes.
Jessica?
Yes.
Annika sent me her vote as a yes. Cliff?
Yes.
Todd?
Yes.
Matt?
Yes.
Joe?
Yes.
And Jay?
Yes.
Thank you. Now we'll move to the next one. Okay, Marshall.
All right. So having defined what that threshold is, now vote to eligibility criteria for low or no occupancy exemption. The recommendation as written here is buildings that fall below the occupancy threshold for either of the preceding 2 years before the compliance period begins are eligible to apply for an exemption for that compliance period. And I'll just add to this that we had some discussion among the co-chairs, and DOE will make an adjustment or a guidance as to how the vacancy and occupancy that may be, or low occupancy that may be caused by the current COVID-19 crisis may affect this, but it was seen as that didn't need to be written into the level of the rules. If someone feels differently, we should talk about that. The other thing I would add is that Annika emailed, and she felt that it was important that there be a defined duration of the low no occupancy prior to the compliance period of 12 months or longer. Andrew, is that sort of by default in the way this is written, or does that require an adjustment based on?
So I think the operable word being occupancy threshold based on the vote that just happened means that we're following EPA's guidance here in terms of how long the period has to be. So all of EPA's figures are based off of annual time-weighted measures, or averages. So it would be like for office, you would be under 55% occupied, time-weighted for the entire year. So you could be 0% occupied for the first half of the year and 100% occupied for the second half of the year, and you would be under 55% for the entire year. Which I don't think totally gets to Annika's.
No, that seems the opposite of what Annika's saying, because I read Annika's comment, and I'm sorry that she was not able to be here. She had a board meeting that she had to attend. But as I read that she's saying that she thinks the low no occupancy itself should be 12 months or longer.
Which is more in line with how benchmarking treats low no occupancy, which is much stricter than what we just voted on for BEPS.
Yeah, that's true. Anyone have any thoughts on this question?
It doesn't seem to me we should deviate from EPA guidance.
So let's say that the COVID, hopefully it doesn't happen, but let's say the COVID crisis ends up having a lot of office buildings and retail empty for 5 months of 2020, and then there's a little bit of vacancy on top of that, say. What does that mean? Does that mean that all of those buildings that are below the 55% occupancy would be able to apply for an exemption to DOEE? I know you sort of addressed this beforehand, but do you want to say more about that?
So I'll chime in, and then Katie, feel free to pop in also if you want to. I think read this outside of the context of COVID. The reason the 2 years is there is to align with the performance period baseline. If we have to make adjustments to the baseline based off of the ongoing COVID crisis or public health crisis, then that will also apply to anything else that references the 2 years preceding. Yeah, Katie, you want anything?
No, I think you explained it well, Andrew. So I think, yeah, this is like a general rule that, if your building falls below the occupancy threshold, then we can't really set a accurate baseline for you, as the law states that the baseline for the performance period has to be the 2 years preceding the beginning of the compliance period. So if your building falls below those occupancy thresholds for that any year in those time, then think about trying to set a performance baseline based on one of those years where you're below the occupancy threshold. That's going to make it pretty difficult for us to set an accurate performance baseline. And so I think, to your point, Cliff, like Andrew said, we're trying to figure out, should we shift that performance baseline for the year, like for this year, this first compliance cycle, just separately, but like generally when we're moving forward as BEPS keeps going, do we want to set an occupancy threshold that people have to meet in order for them to even have it to be applicable to them?
Yeah. But I think this is a good example of how this would work in practice. So for COVID, DOE could decide that the baseline is 2018 and 2019, which would eliminate the risk of COVID, hypothetically, for example. But I think for a given building, this exactly illustrates the distinction that's being drawn here, because a building that is completely unoccupied for for 6 months, and then becomes fully occupied for the remaining 6 months, is time-weighted average occupied for about 50%. But it is definitely not less than 50% occupied for a 12-month period, which was the difference that Annika was trying to draw here. The other thing I think I just want to mention is that the idea of a deadline, there being a deadline for this exemption to be requested, such as no later than 24 months before the end of the compliance period, which I think makes sense. Andrew, is there a reason that we decided not to include that in this vote? Is that covered somewhere else in the rules? Is that the idea, or?
No, I think it's something we didn't cover in the subcommittee meetings.
Got it. Yes, it's
These
not.
are the recommendations in that. If we wanted to modify and add a deadline, I think that's incumbent on the task force to make that motion.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think that you should be able. I think I'll make a motion that I think that this should have a deadline of 2 years before, with the exception that if you are a new owner taking possession of a property, you should be able to. There's, I think, going to be a separate process for that you can get an extension. And if you're a new owner that takes possession of property 1 year before the deadline, and there should have been an exemption requested and it wasn't, you should be able to do that, I think. But otherwise, yeah, it makes sense that we shouldn't have everyone coming in at the last moment.
Well, I think also, Marshall, this is Sharon. We can take like the intent of what we're talking about, and like we can still vote on this recommendation as positive, and then just use the other thing as notes, and not have to change the specific wording, because we're going to take this and write it into the rules as prescribed by the way legal makes us write it. So the wording may not be exactly identical to it anyway. So trying to get the wording right on this slide may not make that much of a difference, maybe, but we can certainly write down the notes of what Annika and what you guys are saying as the recommendation and as this.
Okay.
I don't know. I could certainly sit here and add information to the slide.
This is Cliff. I'm fine with not changing the slide. I recognize that the final rule may not exactly reflect the slide, but for the final rule, I would recommend that you be a little bit more precise. So something like buildings whose average annual occupancy falls below the threshold to better reflect what the EPA rules are.
I like that.
Would everybody be okay with that? Yeah. If the task force is okay with voting on that type of recommendation, with the language, we can work out the specificity of the language.
That makes sense.
Any thoughts?
Yeah, I think that makes sense.
Yeah, I would second that, or third that, or fourth that as well. And I do think there needs to be a deadline, but I think there needs to be a broader deadline for these sorts of requests that needs to be set across the board that should apply here.
So does anyone want to make a motion to vote, or do we want to wait until that language is updated, I guess is the question.
I'll make a motion to vote. This is Jay. And just note the conversation that's happened today.
This is Cliff. Second.
Thank you. Okay, we will do that in the notes. Okay, well, yes, no, or abstain. So Katie?
Yes, I support the recommendation.
Patty?
Yes.
Jen?
Yes.
Marshall?
Yes.
Asa?
Yeah.
Dave?
Yes.
Matt?
Yes.
Adrian?
Yes.
Reshma?
Yes.
Jessica?
Yes.
Annika said yes with the reservation, so I will add those to the notes.
I want to state for the record that as I read her statement, she's saying no based on the fact that it's not a no occupancy period of 12 months or longer. So.
Okay, but I think we're saying a year for either of the preceding 2 years, and she said 12 months or longer, so 12 months. That's why I put her down as a yes. But I can add her comments in the email to the notes.
Okay.
I'll put her as abstain. It's okay. Cliff?
Yes.
Todd?
Yes.
Matt?
Yes.
Joe sent me his votes ahead of time, and his was a yes. Jay?
Yes.
Okay. Number 3.
Okay.
Next one, Marshall.
Cool. Hopefully, sorry this is taking so long. I'll try to be quicker here.
Okay.
3, eligibility criteria for getting an extension. So this proposal is that this one would be that buildings that do not meet the standard at the beginning of the compliance period and that fall below the occupancy threshold during the compliance period are eligible for an extension for up to 3 years to comply with the BEPS. So to translate that for anyone who didn't follow, it means you have a building, its performance is less than the threshold, it has to comply within the 5-year period. It falls below its less than the threshold for BEPS. It falls below the occupancy threshold, and now doesn't have an income stream, or there's other reasons why it needs an extension, and it's eligible to apply for an extension of up to 3 years. That's the proposal.
So,
So
again,
just to clarify, this is buildings that fall below the occupancy threshold of 50% for a period of 1 year or more, right?
Or 80% for multifamily, or 60% for hotels. Yes, okay. Yeah, during the threshold. So they were say it's an office building. It was 80% occupied, and it's had really poor energy performance. And in year 3, it becomes mostly unoccupied, say 30% occupied, and remains that way for more than a year. It would then be eligible to request an extension of up to 3 years. That's the.
Got it. I think that this language is somewhat confusing. So that, again, I think that the time threshold would be important to add in to the rulemaking.
Yeah, we can do that.
Fall below the.
Yeah, I just want to clarify. So since we collect the benchmarking data on an annual basis, and the first slide that we had showed the thresholds that buildings can't fall below, all of the information that we're collecting and the thresholds that we're going to get are going to be on an annual basis, right? So we're going to get all that information annually. So I think in our minds, and it's obviously that it wasn't clear, and so we need to clarify, in our minds that was kind of assumed just because that's the data that we get annual data. But I would greatly appreciate you all bringing that up and stating that we should clarify that.
There's another piece that needs to be clarified. You say buildings that do not meet the standard at the beginning of the compliance period and that fall below the occupancy threshold during the compliance period are eligible, et cetera. As I read that, but it's somewhat ambiguous, that means the buildings must do both of those things. They must not meet the standard at the beginning, and they must fall, their annual average occupancy must fall below the threshold for one of the years of the compliance period in order for them to be eligible for an extension. Is that how you intended it?
Yes.
Well,
I'm reading this.
I don't read that as that being the only reason you could apply for an extension of up to 3 years. But yes, that if a building met the standard at the beginning, it doesn't matter. It has nothing it needs to do within the 5-year period. And if its occupancy occupancy threshold does not fall below, there could be another reason, such as financial hardship or other things we've talked about, that it could apply for an extension.
Yeah, we're strictly addressing the idea in the legislation that says we should provide exemption criteria for vacancy or low occupancy. I can't remember the exact language in the legislation, but basically we're trying to define what that means. So right now the law just says that DOE needs to create criteria for financial hardship, vacancy, change of ownership, and we're trying to define what that vacancy means, basically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right. Also, I had a message in the chat box also to clarify that they don't automatically get the extension. They have to apply for it. They are
Yes.
eligible to apply, and they would actually have to go through a process to apply for it, and that doesn't mean we actually grant it either. So it's a process. Wanted to put that out.
Would it be a subjective judgment of DOEE, like if someone had low occupancy in 2021, but they were very fully occupied for the remaining 4 years? Would DOEE have the subjective right to deny the extension request, or would it be you would only have to confirm the facts and then you would be obliged to provide the extension?
I think that's really depends on how it's written in the rules, honestly, and it depends on. I think it's a great question, Cliff, and I think that the way that I was seeing it was that we would have folks, ask for an extension. It's not really an exemption. It's a delay of compliance. Is the way that it's basically written into the legislation. So they'd request the delay of compliance. They'd say we want it for this reason, and we'd say, okay, provide the proper documentation to prove that occurred. And then I think we'd probably have to come up with some sort of objective criteria so that we could make sure that we're being consistent. But at some point, there might be some subjectivity that we'd need to factor in. I don't know. That's a great question. I think I want to hear from all of you as to how you think that should be handled.
This seems like an opportune moment to go on, Sharon.
Well, and I was just saying we don't need to talk criteria today, so we can put that on the schedule for another day because I think that gets super complicated.
Yeah, it does. Though it's worth noting. I mean, Annika also emailed and said she didn't support this one because she felt there was already a process for people to apply for an extension, and they should be able to apply for an extension, and this could be a reason they apply for an extension, but that it didn't need to be called out. Her words were, they may have had tenants move out to address a performance improvement project, and now the rules would give them more time to do that project than other people would. And which sort of gets, I think, to
I was going to say something very similar, that this seems to be duplicative of the financial hardship. The reason that they couldn't do this was likely because they're in a tough place. So I don't really feel like this adds anything.
Yeah, so are you saying, if I understand correctly, that you're saying that if a building is needing an extension, because its occupancy became low, that would be generally because it ended up in financial hardship as a result, and that there's no need for absent financial hardship for there to be this specific call out. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, essentially. And like on the flip side, even if they have low or no occupancy, that's the perfect time to be doing renovations as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, instead of putting it off.
Hey, this is Jen from DGS. I'm just trying to run through different scenarios in my head. If it's like a school that's being mothballed, which happens often in the district government portfolio, at least, it may not make sense to do retrofits at the school until they figure out what the future use of the building will be, at which point they would build into the design for the modernization of making the building more energy efficient.
Yeah, this is Sharon. I think having occupancy just for the sake of occupancy or vacancy as a reason for an extension as a possibility, and then they have to make their case, like for an extension. And there's, I think, a lot of different reasoning behind it. And if we put this in the rules, then it gives us at DOEE the flexibility to be able to, manage the extension process easier, I guess.
Or you put this in the rules and it locks you into giving extensions that maybe otherwise wouldn't be deserved. I think you could look at that either way.
Well, what I'm hearing is that DOE will ultimately make that decision. So enforcement agency would still have that control.
Oh, Andrew, do you wanted to just say it?
It's fine. The conversation went different directions.
Okay. We were looking back at the legislative language, and I think the word occupancy or vacancy is actually written in there already, so we need to define it.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so I think
that's what I was trying to say earlier, is like vacancy is in the law, and it says that building owners can apply for an exemption. Actually, it says DOE shall establish exemption criteria for building owners if they can demonstrate to the satisfaction of DOE financial distress, change of ownership, vacancy. So it's already in the
Right.
law
We need
that they can
to
apply
define it.
for this
Yeah.
under vacancy. So we're trying to figure out with you all how we should define that.
And I think the one thing I also wanted to add to that was that we can obviously write in subjective words into the rules, like DOE will consider these criteria, but I wanted to also point out that the operable word of up to 3 years means that we have some discretion in terms of what type of extension we are offering to the building owner based on the criteria. So like Cliff, in your example where they're vacant in 2021 and maybe that's screwed up their capital cycle a little bit, but like doesn't mean that they're going to be able to meet the savings long term. We can say, okay, you get an extra year, or yeah, I don't know. Also, thank you, Molly, for posting the legislative language in the chat.
So yeah, I think that makes sense. I mean, I think the strongest case is the one that Jen made, a building that is currently vacant and or you can demonstrate that it will be vacant for an extended period of time, especially if there's a possibility that it will be, demolished or significantly repurposed. That's the strongest argument for an extension. And so I think it makes sense to provide that. A low occupancy in 2021, for instance, is probably the weakest argument for an extension if it's then fully occupied for the balance of the period. I think perhaps the vacancy exemption should be around buildings that are currently vacant or anticipated that they will be vacant for an extended period of time. And then if don't meet that criteria, then sort of following ASA's suggestion, other buildings would have to submit using the financial hardship avenue.
Yeah, so basically just to summarize the discussion, we're kind of back to, yes, we're allowing this recommendation and we're okay to vote on this. This would be just a kind of a standard occupancy or vacancy extension recommendation.
Yeah, I mean, I'm hearing a general desire for there to be regulatory flexibility in interpreting this and seeing what is actually appropriate on a building by building basis. But yeah.
Yeah, I would be more comfortable if it read something like buildings that do not meet the standard at the beginning of the compliance period and whose annual average occupancy falls below the threshold or is below the threshold at the end of the cycle, or it's proven to DOE satisfaction that it will fall below that threshold for an extended period in the future, are eligible for an extension of up to 3 years to comply with BEPS.
So, Cliff.
Just a suggestion. It might be helpful to just rejigger the wording based on what Cliff just said and what DOE's thoughts are, and then vote on it later.
Yeah.
I was just about to suggest that same thing.
Yeah. So
if anyone has thoughts on this particular one, because we did share the slide deck with everyone in the task force, and this is vote number 3, so you can find the slide pretty easy. If you guys have thoughts about maybe how this could be rewritten or something like that, if you just want to email them to me, this is Sharon. I think that would maybe, for the folks that were part of the discussion or have some other thoughts, then send them to me, and then we'll put this on. Maybe we'll have a couple versions of the language, or maybe we'll come up with one that DOE maybe likes, and then we can put this at the beginning of the next meeting. As that sounds.
So hearing that, I make a motion that we table this vote till next meeting, as Sharon just discussed. All right.
Okay.
Do we need to vote on that, Sharon? How does that work?
I don't think so. No, we're
Okay.
just tabling the discussion. It's fine.
Okay.
To not vote.
we don't need to take a roll call vote on a decision not to vote. I'm really glad to
Not
hear
to
that.
vote.
Cool.
I love it. Okay.
All right. Moving on.
Number
Let's
4.
see if we can. Oh my God, it's already 3:18. This is gonna eject me from being chair for having such a long discussion here. Okay, now vote for exclusion of low, no occupancy buildings from the standard data set. This one is hopefully a little simpler. DOE will remove low occupancy buildings when determining the standard regardless of if they apply for an exemption or extension or not. This is to ensure data quality. So what this means, DOE will use the occupancy percentage data they get to, when they set the standard at the start, remove these buildings. But if those buildings don't want an extension, they still have to, they still have to apply, as already discussed. But yes. Is there anything? Does anyone have any comments on this question? Or questions about this one?
Seems straightforward.
Oui.
I make a motion to vote.
I second.
So it was Katie did the motion,
Oh, sorry.
and Marshall
Katie made a motion.
did the second. Okay. Any other final discussion? Just want to make sure.
Thank you, Sharon. Cutting it off too fast here.
You were shutting down that discussion quick.
I didn't mean to shut it down. I'm just like,
love
oh my
it.
God, we spent so much time on the last one.
No. Any questions about this one? This one's pretty simple. Okay, then we'll start voting. Katie,
Yes.
Patty,
Yes.
Jen,
Yes.
Marshall,
Yes.
Asa,
Yes.
Dave,
Yes.
Max, Adrian,
Yes.
Reshma,
Yes.
Jessica.
Yes.
Annika said yes. Cliff,
Yes.
Todd,
Yes.
Matt.
Yes.
Joe sent me his vote as yes. And Jay.
Yes.
And Max, you may have been on mute. I didn't hear your vote. You may have popped off. Okay, we're good. Go to the next.
Cool.
Vote 5, equivalent metric.
Equivalent metric. Use source energy use intensity for the equivalent metric in setting the standard for property type groups that do not receive a 1 to 100 Energy Star score.
Can someone remind me, did we discuss why it's source UI and not weather normalized source UI?
We did not discuss that and kind of left it out of the discussion. I think it makes the most sense to use weather normalized if we if we choose to vote and adopt on one of the compliance pathways we're talking about later, the standard target pathway.
Yeah.
So, and I would expand to say, my preference would be weather and occupancy or occupant characteristics normalized. Obviously, that's not available for all building types, but for those that it is available, I think that should be the first option, and then source EUI where it's not available.
Yeah.
So, Cliff, just to clarify, adjusted normalized source EUI for occupancy is only available for those with an Energy Star score. So those would just fall into the standard metric, and then those that can't get the score or adjusted normalized would just get would get source UI or weather normalized. That's the limitation we're living with here.
Yeah. If I could chime in on my understanding of the weather normalized issue, weather normalized matters a lot in two conditions. One, you're looking at comparisons over time, which is why weather normalized is used for the performance pathway. It also matters when you're looking across geographies and buildings have different weather stations. In DC, every building uses the same weather station, and in a single year, weather normalized is just going to raise or lower all boats to some extent. I don't think it makes a major difference. What it does do is mean that several, and if I'm wrong on this, Andrew or someone else, please correct me, but this is my understanding. But my other understanding on this is that there are certain buildings that for example, buildings that use fuel oil as a backup source and do not get sufficient number of deliveries a year, that cannot get a weather normalized source EUI, but they do get a source EUI. And so there are buildings, number of buildings that don't get a weather normalized source EUI for that or another reason.
So yes, traditional way of benchmarking, they would not get a weather normalized source EUI. There's a workaround that EPA acknowledges. It's really just a system level thing in Portfolio Manager, and we've actually begun to, in this round of data collection for benchmarking, begun to correct for those, or to follow up with building owners that have fuel oil to have them enter in a way that they can get weather normalized. So it's a data quality issue / enforcement issue on our end, not necessarily.
So that's a solvable problem.
Yeah.
Am I right, Andrew, that it doesn't make a substantive difference for a set of buildings in a single year within a geography, or is that not true?
No, that's totally true. In a given year, it makes marginal no difference for buildings. In the long run, if we're comparing year over year, it will.
Can I ask for clarity there? Because in my sense, by not weather normalizing, we could potentially penalize certain subsets of buildings, such as an all-electric heated building with a more extreme weather, or more extreme winter weather with a higher heating load. By not normalizing, that subset of buildings is going to be penalized compared to another year that's more mild for buildings that have different system types.
So that could generally be a problem if we were a geography that was to experience extreme cold weather. Like we're not Minnesota.
Hold on, but
is that what you're sort of getting at, or are you talking?
Yeah, we've experienced polar vortex. I mean, a couple years ago we were, $1 million in the red in Q1 just from 5 days of having to operate 24/7 because temperatures. I mean, we do experience, at least for office buildings where we have to operate maybe overnight or over the weekend. Those months are going to look anomalous to our sort of standard winter weather.
Got it. Okay. I mean, then in that case, that would be if that's what we're seeing on the ground, and you've noticed a difference in your EUI, that would be a case for weather normalized.
Andrew, but is that just for 1 year? Like if let's say we're setting the standard for 2019, and these are this is just to set the BEPS standard for the property type groups. This is not performance.
Right. But even if it's 1 year, are we penalizing certain buildings compared to others?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, Matt, go ahead. You said it.
No, that's it. I mean, that's my fear is that certain building, correct, we're not following that trend, but in a particular year, certain buildings will be penalized by not being able to weather normalize because of the system types that they have.
Mm-hmm.
Andrew, so my question for you is this, because this only applies to like our 5% buildings, and it's a larger percentage of the DGS portfolio, but in thinking of the buildings where this is going to apply and setting the standard, do you think the weather normalized is going to make a difference?
I don't know. I mean, you'd have to look at the data, which I have charts on it somewhere. I think ultimately it shows pretty negligible results. Addie, are you on the phone by chance? Can I call on you? You ran these numbers yourself, but if not, I think ultimately to normalize or not to normalize, we're not hurting anybody by normalizing. We're potentially hurting people by not normalizing.
I mean, so long as if you're now able to adjust for the fuel oil issue that was such a big thorn in our side back in the early years of the program, then yeah, that's good news, and we could help people here.
What if, because I think it sounds like everybody's okay with source EUI. What if we run the vote as which one they prefer, whether it's weather or source?
Weather normalized versus not.
Yeah, I don't know if that's worth the because if the majority of the Taskforce would prefer weather just to make sure that we're accounting for that, then that's our answer and we've done our vote.
So are you suggesting that we vote and there are 4 options? It's weather, Normalized, not weather normalized, no, if you don't like either of these, or abstain. Is that the proposal?
I don't know. I think everybody may be okay with source. I may be making an assumption there. Maybe we go through the vote once and say whether or not.
Not whether or no.
And hey, real quick question, just as a reminder, source, you get credit for having on-site solar, right?
Yes.
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 Thank you.
This is Cliff. I think
It's
going with weather normalized EUI is good, and I think I agree with what Andrew said, that you're not going to be able to currently using Portfolio Manager to normalize for occupancy if you're ineligible for that 1 to 100 score. But I don't think we want the rules to foreclose the possibility that if the technology improves, you would, if there are buildings for which you could occupancy normalize, DOEE should have the option of using that when Energy Star scores are not available. Currently, that's not an option using Portfolio Manager, so it would be sort of a moot point. But I don't think we want to tie DOEE's hands. I think it's preferable for DOEE to be able to normalize for occupancy if that were an available option.
So should the vote be normalize, unnormalize, no, abstain?
Yeah, I think that's fine. I think you could just say normalized, and it would be understood that this means for now it's just weather normalized.
Which is what the performance path says currently, which gives us the flexibility to use adjusted to current year or weather.
Yeah.
Okay. So we're voting for normalized versus no.
Normalized.
That sounds good to me.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hi, this is Dave. Before we vote, can I just clarify that this is applicable just to standalone buildings, not campuses? Just want to make sure that.
Right, your campus carve out is separate for this particular question.
Just wanted to clarify that. Thanks.
Yep.
All right, so yeah, this does not apply to campuses.
Campus carve out's a separate line item.
It's a carve out. You're carved out of everything, I guess.
Okay, so are we ready to do a vote? Marshall, do you want to say what we're voting?
Yes. So to clarify, we're going to have I will make a motion to vote, and the motion will be that we will vote, and when your name is called, you will say normalized EUI, source EUI, or non-normalized EUI, whichever you find easier to say, or just no, or neither, or abstain. So there are 4 options: normalized, not normalized, neither, abstain.
Okay.
I think that's the easiest way to say it. Someone else has an easier way to say it.
I just want to make sure I record votes properly. Okay. Katie.
Normalized.
Patty.
Normalized.
Jen.
Normalized.
Marshall.
Normalized.
Asa.
Normalized.
Dave.
Normalized.
Max. Adrian.
Normalized.
Reshma.
Normalized.
Jessica.
Normalized.
Okay, I'm going to put Annika down as abstain since she didn't hear the
amendment.
discussion.
Yeah.
Cliff.
Normalized.
Todd.
Normalized.
Matt.
Normalized.
Joe. I put him as abstain because he didn't hear the
I'm
conversation.
back, and I vote normalize. Thank you.
Thank you. Jay.
Normalized.
Okay, that was it. Complicated but easy vote. Next one, vote 6, property type groups less than 10 buildings.
Property types groups less than 10 buildings. The buildings should be ranked individually against the national median. Discussion? Questions? Well, then I will propose a thing here based on something Annika said that I think this should be a national median, and as determined by DOEE, and then there should be a procedure for building types to request a different national median than, say, the Energy Star one. Again, looking back to the discussion on Labs 21 that we had in the previous meeting. I don't think we need to get into the rules, don't need to talk about Labs 21 specifically, but there needs to be a process for building owners to say, or for someone to say, the standard one that EPA recognizes is not appropriate for this building, and I think saying a national median as determined by DOE probably would give that flexibility.
I second that, Jen.
And this is Patty Boyd. I third that, I guess. I'm curious how this fits in with buildings that are, maybe the only one like themselves, like that lab, where those guys, they really went, Annika wrote out a whole 2 pages of design elements that went into that lab design to make it one of the most efficient, if not maybe the most efficient of its kind in the United States. I don't know. I mean, they went, every energy efficiency measure that I've heard of, they put into effect there. Now, does that mean they're operating their building, more or less efficiently than they could? That's a good question. But they have done everything in the design to where I don't think it's possible for them to improve by 20%.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if that fits in right here or in a later one, but how when you've gotten to net zero, not that they're net zero, because they're not, obviously they're a lab, but this falls into the same group as the net zero buildings. When you've gotten to net zero, how do you improve by 20%? So yeah. I just want to throw that out there.
This is Cliff. I agree with those points, and I agree with Annika's suggestion of saying a national rather than the national. But I would also make one small additional change to provide greater flexibility to DOEE. I would say a national data set, not a national median. That locks DOEE potentially into using the median, and I think DOEE, under the law, it may set it no lower than the median, but it has the option to go higher. And I think you want to use a national data set, and then presumably it's typically going to be the median, but DOEE has the option to go higher.
I like that, especially given that the Labs 21 metric may give you a comparable EUI to be compared to, but it may not. I don't recall whether it technically uses the term median as that benchmark point. So.
Yeah, that makes sense, Jen.
Yeah.
Okay, so could we propose that the vote be that it be compared to a national data set, or the building owner has to apply for something else? Like it would be like that the EPA national data set, or they apply for something else.
It would be. Does
that make sense?
Yeah, saying like the default would be EPA Energy Star, the CBEX, or whatever what gets defaulted to Energy Star, and then they'd have to apply to use something else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I don't know if we need to wordsmith at this level of detail. I like the idea of it saying against a national data set. And then, yeah, I think the actual rules you may want to say, as determined by DOE, the default will be based on the data sets collected by Energy Star. But DOE shall have the flexibility. Building owners or DOE can set a different standard. Building owners can apply, etc.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Make a motion to vote on it that way. This is
Second.
Cliff and Katie. Okay. Any other discussion? Okay, so we're back to our yes, no, or abstain.
Mm-hmm.
So, Katie?
Yes.
Patty?
Sorry, and this is with the this is with the data set or a national?
Yes. Against
Yes.
Against
Go
a
ahead.
national data set.
Okay, I say yes.
Jen,
Yes.
Marshall,
Yes.
Asa,
Yes.
Dave,
Yes.
Max,
Yes.
yes, I heard you that time. Yay. We were having some voice issues. Adrian,
Yes.
Reshma,
Yes.
Jessica,
Yes.
Annika, I think we ended up,
I think
Marshall,
this is
do
a
you
yes.
say yes? Okay. Cliff,
Yes.
Todd,
Yes.
Matt,
Yes.
Joe,
Yes.
Jay.
Sorry. Yes.
Okay, one more. Number 7.
One last time. Vote 7, setting the standard above the local median. Again, reminder, the legislative language, building energy performance standards shall be no lower than the district median Energy Star score for properties of each property type. And so the recommendation here after the discussion last time that we'll be voting on is to set the standard at the district median, whether that is Energy Star score or equivalent metric, for the first cycle. Again, this is for buildings with more than 10 buildings. The previous vote, this doesn't apply to those buildings, but which wouldn't be compared to a district median by definition. But yeah, for everything else, yeah.
Any discussion or questions? We have a motion to vote.
I make a motion to vote. This is Katie.
I'll second. This is Jay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, this is a yes, no, or abstain. Katie?
Yeah.
Yes.
Patty?
Yes.
Jen?
Yes.
Marshall?
Yes.
Asa?
Yes.
Dave?
Yes.
Matt?
Yes.
Adrian?
Yes.
Reshma?
Yes.
Jessica?
Yes.
Annika's vote was a yes. Cliff?
Abstain.
Todd?
Yes.
Matt?
Yes.
Joe?
Yes.
Jay?
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
we're done with voting.
Yeah. I think
Thanks,
it's just.
everybody.
I just want to say for the record here, it's clear this is for the first cycle. So
Yes.
this vote doesn't carry anything with regard to how it would go in the future.
That's right.
All right, we're done with voting. That only took an hour.
Okay, on to the first
On
topic.
to the next topic. So, yeah, I'll just lead off the discussion here. So this again, we're just revisiting the performance pathways and the standard target. Again, the decision. This is about whether or not there's right now the performance compliance pathway is that buildings do not meet the standard must reduce their site EUI by 20%, and again, I believe that's normalized. The standard target compliance pathway that would be buildings that do not meet the standard must reduce their site EUI by 20% or reduce their source EUI to meet the standard for its property type group. So, Andrew, you had some graphs here you wanted to present?
Sorry, do you mind going back to the other slide, Sharon?
Yeah,
I just want to clarify what we were testing here. This is modeled scenarios that we were looking at. If we were to take this into some sort of recommendation, that we would obviously say normalized site UI and energy or score would be in here for the standard target, and so would normalize source UI. But this is the data we had available to actually model out what this needs to be.
And Andrew, would you have the ability to, assuming that an update to the Energy Star score model happens during the compliance period, are you going to have the ability to go back and either figure out what the score would be under the old model, or figure out what the old score would, the building's, reference point would be, would be under the new model in order to adjust for that one way or the other?
Yeah, I think we'd have the capability to do that. With moving to automatic reporting, I think there's only like 5% of buildings that aren't enrolled, which means we have live data for all those buildings, and we have access to historic data for those buildings when necessary. So if we needed to go back and rerun a year to basically like determine what the score would have been or should have been or is now, we have that ability moving forward.
Okay.
And this is Sharon, just to maybe add to this discussion, for folks that maybe haven't heard this discussion before and are listening to this for the first time. I think the easiest way to describe the standard target compliance path is something that we're suggesting as a possible new compliance path is, so let's say you have an office building and the office median is a 68, that's the median for 2018 for office buildings, and your building was a 64 and you were only 4 points away. It's pretty difficult for you to kind of get that 20% reduction. What we're saying on the standard target compliance path is that you would reduce your source EUI to just fill in that gap and just get to that standard equivalent source EUI to get to that 68 instead of trying to get a full 20% if you are that close to the standard. That's what this particular compliance path means in a little bit more simpler terms. If that helps anyone.
That's helpful. That's very helpful. Thank you.
That's how I explain it to everybody when I do the presentation and talk about it. This is an option. Because this doesn't make a lot of sense to some people.
Yeah, it's not totally intuitive. Thanks.
It just doesn't. Do you want me to go to the next slide, or?
Yeah, we've kind of showed the next slide a lot. This is just the savings gap we see between the what is the base law right now, so just the performance pathway, the 20% reduction, modeled savings over 5 cycles compared to what we'd see from the median target. And the savings is quite stark, but I would basically say my own modeling approach is somewhat limited in how we looked at these savings, and that this assumes everyone's doing the bare minimum and no one is trying to get above the standard to avoid compliance. This assumes no one takes the prescriptive pathway. This also excludes, a good chunk of the building population, since we're only looking at the 5 largest emitting sectors in the district, so office, hotel, K-12, college, hospital. So I will just say my numbers are somewhat limited here, and take it with a grain of salt and a giant uncertainty bar around each of these lines.
Okay.
Okay.
Just
So
to clarify, I think we're talking about all the EUIs should be read as normalized EUIs, I think, right? And that's particularly important here because you're comparing buildings to themselves or to prior years. So.
Absolutely. And we weren't able to model that because we can't predict the weather or buildings, 40 years out in the future, but that's how it would be written. Yeah.
Alternatively, you could say by definition you have assumed it is normalized because you're not trying to adjust for future weather.
That would be the counter argument, yes.
And what about the distinction between site and source? Is that like I'm noticing that slide where like it's site, and then the red text says source. What's the rationale for switching to source, or if you're going for the target when everything else is site?
Right. So the target is based on what the standard is. So in like how we would normally talk about BEPS, it would be the Energy Star score would be what you're trying to target. That's the standard you're targeting, or the equivalent metric, which is source energy. The difference from the performance path is that the performance path is explicitly written out in the legislation as being site EUI. So the very nature of and to make it hopefully a little bit more understandable to a building owner that is looking at their data and figuring out which pathways easiest to look at, they would look at their score and be like, okay, I'm only a couple points away, I can raise this up, or a 20% reduction in site EUI. We could express that in terms of site EUI. It would just be a kind of complicated back calculation that would probably confuse people more than it needs to.
And the performance pathway would remain, even in this proposal, would remain available regardless. So a building that has a building with a Energy Star score of 5 would still be able to qualify by doing a 20% improvement. One could argue a building in that case would probably take the prescriptive path because they probably don't have the competence. But that's beside the point.
Could you go back one slide so we can see the slide we're talking about again?
2 slides.
2 slides, sorry. So is there a reason why it's source EUI and not Energy Star score?
Because I was trying to explain this at the top. We had limited data for modeling these savings. This is all based on the next slide, which is the actual estimated savings from these policies. And so we could only model source EUI, and we determined that since it's closest to Energy Star score, that's appropriate for modeling. We can't model the long-term impacts of the Energy Star score. So it's just, if we were to adopt this, this would read or reduce or raise Energy Star score to the standard, or reduce normalized source EUI to meet the standard for the property type group.
So there would be 3 options. You could either reduce normalized source EUI, or you're saying that for those buildings that can't qualify for the Energy Star, then they'd be using normalized source EUI.
Yes. So it's basically whatever your standard metric is, the metric is of your standard, you would be using that to try to target the median.
Or whatever the standard was, if in the future cycles it's not the median.
Yes.
Just to further confuse. I'm sorry.
Standard. Thank you, Marshall. No.
Yeah.
Good point.
Yeah. Whatever the standard is for your property type group for that cycle.
Yes.
Improve your metric. Your
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And is the thought to meet it at any point in the 5 years, or at the end of the 5 year?
At the end, right?
At the end.
At the end. Does anyone have any reservations about offering this? Because we really, I think, want to offer this.
I'll just speak up. I've raised this before, and just point out that just to remind everyone that the savings, there is a substantial reduction in savings. That to get to carbon neutrality, we have to take everything to 11, and this will mean that other actions have to be deeper in the future. Now, it may be that if we're really concerned, maybe that's GHG-based actions and electrification, and not based on reducing your, changing your Energy Star score. But it reduces. I'm not saying we shouldn't do it. I'm saying we need to be conscious that this just reduces the savings the district's going to see from BEPS, and therefore there will have to be other policies that fill that gap at some point.
This is Sharon. I'd love to maybe float an idea. One of the main reasons that this idea was proposed was because, especially in the office group, that's such a high-performing group at a 68 for the 2018 median, that people who were at like a 65 or a 67, that they were within a couple of points of the median, were really kind of struggling mentally with how to get 20% performance targets or prescriptive path items out of this. It's honestly where this original idea came from, was from that group. So if we don't, let's say if we think about our low performing groups versus our high performing groups, which we haven't really talked about this particular idea, what if we only offered a standard target pathway to property type groups that were over the national median?
Hmm.
I don't know, just to throw it out there. Or what other reservations would everybody have about offering this their target?
That's an interesting idea.
Sharon, I think that's a great point. I think the whole point of this is to, if you're 1 or 2 points away in a high performing group, that you don't, you're not getting hit with a 20% hammer. I think we're going to face objections to that.
Right.
Yeah, I think there's definitely value in, trying to go after aggressive standards, but also not turning people off the law and their support for it.
Yeah, but then if you're a group, so the way that would work, then if you're a group where, to pick on warehouses, on house of worship for a second, where the median is a 19, if you have an Energy Star of 18, you don't just have to increase your Energy Star score by 1 point. You still have some low-hanging fruit, and you would still do either the prescriptive or the performance pathway.
Right.
I'll just voice, I think it's puts us down a faulty path to ascribe different standards for different property types. More from a political standpoint than a policy standpoint.
It's a good point.
Yeah, and I know the last meeting, Andrew, you had presented some of the differences across geographic locations from the Energy Star scores, and I think it's clear. I mean, it seemed clear from that there's probably some differences in the algorithms themselves for the Energy Star score. Probably lends itself to, like, where the East Coast seem to be, for hospitality in general and things like that, seem to have lower scores, and there may be some underlying issues with the algorithm perhaps that we might not want to be more aggressive. I don't know. I mean, that's just was one of my observations from the data that you showed in our last meeting.
Mm-hmm. It's worth seeing. I would say,
what if we only did this for the first cycle?
I think that's an improvement.
I mean, if it's only for the first cycle, it's going to be harder to get a 20% improvement in the next cycle than it is in this cycle. So I don't know if that solves the problem. It just kicks the can down the road. Nothing wrong potentially with kicking the can, but
adjustments. Well, and if we think about maybe adjustments we might have to make because of the COVID-19 situation, I'm just trying to.
Yeah. I will say I think if we do this, that we should have. It definitely should be standard target plus, say plus 5%, because I would hate for a building owner. What we don't want to have is building owners in situations where, I only have to increase my Energy Star score by 1 point or 2 points, so I'm not going to do anything, and I'm just going to be perpetually, and then everyone's going to improve a little bit. It's going to go up by a few points, and I'm going to just be in a perpetually a cycle of just being slightly below and being hit by this every 5 years. So I think. Right?
Sorry, I agree with you, Marshall, but I think there's a question of, what do we encourage and provide to people in terms of like technical assistance to tell them like that's not really a smart thing to do because you kind of want to keep improving yourself so you can get above the standard for the next cycle, and a difference of what we're actually going to regulate and fine people on. And that to me is the difference here is what are we actually going to issue fines to people on? So we're setting sort of a floor here, and people have to get above it. And if they get there, then we're not going to fine them, but they're not being smart if they don't go above and beyond that, right?
Well, yes, but also if you set the floor, the way medians work is if you set it a little bit higher, that doesn't guarantee anything either because everyone will have to hit that one, right? Like, getting slightly above the median gets you compliance in the first cycle, but if you require everyone to do the median plus 5%, it just moves the median that much further. You do nothing to guarantee compliance in the second cycle, and I don't think that's the purpose of this either. The purpose of getting compliance in the first cycle is not to get compliance in the second cycle, it's just to get compliance in the first cycle.
Okay, that's a good point.
I think the purpose is to help the district meet its climate goals. And we want people to save energy as early as possible. So having some sort of incentive for people to save energy sooner rather than later, so that the longer you wait, the higher standard you have to meet. I think that's helping achieve the purpose of the law.
Yeah, I think that gets to the next. We haven't the next agenda item, assuming we ever get there, on deep retrofits, and I think that's maybe the way we do that. I also think that it just occurs to me that I think there's going to need to be education from DOE, just reminding building owners that Energy Star scores tend to jump around and fluctuate by a couple points. Most building owners, it'll be a couple points up or down each year, and so, if you're 1 point below, you still probably want to do more just to be safe. Yeah. But Matt, I hear your point yeah, if you have 5%, that just drops the median up, so doesn't really solve that problem.
I do like Sharon's suggestion of just making this apply to the first cycle if we're going to do it. My preferred alternative, we already sort of decided not to go with, which was the last one on the first slide, which was crossed out, which I think sort of more equitably spreads the burden across buildings that just barely miss it, so they don't have to improve as much, but buildings that are the lowest performing in some cases would have to improve by more than 20%. But if we're not going to do that, then I think we shouldn't tie our hands for more than the first cycle and put ourselves on a path of not saving enough carbon.
Yeah, I don't know how, Katie, how would you do it for only the first cycle if you're putting it in the rules? Because you put it in the rules, it's in the rules as a path. You'd have to amend the rules to remove it, right? Or no?
I mean, we could write it. I mean, Molly's on the phone. She could probably speak to that better than I could. But I think we would say, for this compliance cycle, this is a path that's available. But my question on that is, the first cycle is only the 50,000 square foot plus buildings. The next cycle, we're going to incorporate the 25 to 50. And then the next cycle, we're going to incorporate the 10 to 25. So are we not going to offer it to those buildings who are having to meet BEPS for the first time?
I mean, that's obviously, you're kicking the can down the road. You have to decide that in a few years. You would also have the option of permitting the smaller buildings to use that compliance path, but limiting it to only the smaller buildings, and the larger buildings would have to do, let's say, the 20% path.
Yeah.
Or
it's the first cycle. There's also new buildings that will get built. So if it's the first cycle for any building, then a building that's being built, gets to not, even if it's a 200,000 square foot building built in 10 years, it's not asked to reduce 20% right away, though. Hopefully any building built then would be net zero anyway, so it wouldn't be a moot point, but you could word it that way where it applies to the first cycle for a building.
I think we could probably write it that way, but that's up to our legal experts.
Well, aren't all the rules to some extent subject to change for BEPS too? Right?
We can update rules, but what happens when you do an update of rules, you have to put them back out for public comment.
I mean, this is an alternative compliance path. I think you can just sunset the alternative compliance path. This path, you just write into the rule that it's available before this year. And then unless you make a change, it'll automatically sunset after that year.
That this isn't still a problem we're solving in future cycles. Because it's not like this isn't a get out of jail free card for lots of properties, right? It's only going to make sense for the folks that are just barely missing, right? It's not like it's not helping a lot of people. Right.
Exactly.
But it does, the people that it does help, they're being like, wow, that was thoughtful. This is fair, right? I'm able to get my buildings up to the threshold, right? And so I'm better than 50% of the buildings in the city at this point. So I feel like it doesn't affect a ton of buildings, and it's fair, and that's true in the second cycle and the third cycle.
Well, if you look at Andrew's modeling, it actually has a pretty significant carbon impact, and the impact gets larger over time with each cycle.
I mean, it does seem like and I think we've talked about this before, looking at modeling beyond the second cycle seems like it's not really worth us getting hung up on at this stage, especially if we're revisiting whether or not we're doing an efficiency standard or a greenhouse gas standard past the second cycle.
You could also address this a different way. You could keep this standard, you could have the standard target path, but in a future cycle, no longer use the local median and target a higher standard. like which we were talking about. That's another way to get to the same result.
Right.
This is Asa. I don't like the idea of putting something temporary in place to change it. This is big and it's complicated. It's going to take people a while to get used to. Doing something temporarily to me just seems like it's going to cause more confusion than good. And I'd rather that we spend the time to think through things and create good long-term solutions.
I think that's a good point, especially as we're talking about buildings making investments that are beyond just 5 years sort of planning cycles.
Well, I do think the most equitable for all buildings that will also give you good carbon savings is that fourth option that we crossed out. Mm-hmm. That allows the buildings that just missed the standard to just narrow the gap by half, say, or narrow the gap by 70%. So it's actually even kinder to them than the second standard, but it requires more of the buildings that are least efficient that can most easily get the biggest savings. Because they would have to save more than 20%, the least efficient buildings.
Yeah, and just to remind you, the reason that was crossed out was that would require an update to the legislation, and thus would probably delay the ability of this program to get launched this year. That was the problem, I think. Not debating the wisdom of the idea, but just practically speaking. The wisdom of the idea does debate to the question of, there's another equitability standpoint, which is, are those really poor performing buildings also often poorly resourced and unable to, cut their energy use by 50%? But that's neither here nor there. I think the practical matter is, I think the city's going to have, there's a requirement to look at a greenhouse gas standard, and maybe all of this gets changed. So,
could I ask a point, because I do want to get to the next.
Yeah, I do too.
Time. And this is not a vote, but maybe we could, because we've done this in the past, maybe kind of go through the list and just kind of see where people stand on it, because I think it's the same 5 people that are having the discussion about it, and I don't know how everybody feels about it. So maybe we could run through the roll call real quick. And we'll go ahead and state this for the recording, that this is not an official vote on whether or not the task force would recommend having a standard target compliance pathway to the DOEE. But you could say, I'll state names, and then you could say, yes, I support having, yes or no or abstain to offering this pathway, and just so we can kind of see where we are. And then the co-chairs can kind of take this back, and we'll decide what to do at the next meeting. How's that sound, Marshall?
I think that sounds really good, and I've definitely been talking a lot, so I appreciate that.
Okay.
I think if we're not voting, this doesn't distill to yes, no, abstain. So I would like to invite everyone to, you can say yes, no, abstain, or if you feel like you can't express your thoughts in less than a sentence or two,
Or if you want to make a comment, yeah, that would be great. Okay. I'll go through the roll call. Katie?
Yes, I support offering the standard target pathway.
Okay. Patty?
Would it be helpful to have the slide with the standard pathway on it, in front of us right now?
Oh, sorry, it's on the wrong computer. Patty, did you want to say a yes, no, or abstain?
Oh shoot, I'm sorry. I thought I didn't realize there were 2 mute buttons on. Yes, I hit yes to the pathway.
Okay. Jen?
Sorry. Yes to the pathway.
Marshall?
I'm going to abstain. I'm not sure it's the right move, but I don't know that I have a better solution.
Gotcha. Asa?
Abstain.
Dave?
I support the standard target compliance pathway.
Okay. Max?
Yes.
Adrian?
Yes.
Adrian, could you say that again?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Reshma?
Yes, I support the standard target compliance pathway.
Jessica?
Yes, I support it.
Okay. Annika's not here. Cliff?
I would support the standard target compliance pathway for the first cycle, and then announcing now that for the second cycle and every cycle thereafter, it would switch to the gap reduction, removing the performance compliance pathway, recognizing that that would require legislation.
Okay. Todd?
Yes, I support the pathway, and I would like to see it implemented consistently throughout the cycles.
Okay. Matt?
I support that pathway and keeping it the same for all future cycles.
Okay. Joe?
Yes, I support it.
And Jay?
I support it. I do think that we should look for future cycles, whether this is only applied to the buildings coming online during that cycle, or if it continues kind of over time.
Okay.
For all projects.
That's a good note. Thank you. Okay. I will take that back and we'll discuss it offline with the co-chairs and kind of bring this back to the group afterwards. Thank you, everybody. That was awesome discussion. Okay. Marshall.
All right, deep retrofit definition. Deep retrofit. So we're going to have a brief discussion about the idea of a pathway or process to incentivize people to target deeper savings earlier, otherwise known as deep retrofits. And so we thought it might be helpful to start with a definition. What do we mean by a deep retrofit? And certainly welcome people's different definitions of what they mean when they think about this. But thought it would be worth sharing that there is a definition of this in the Clean Energy DC plan, which, full disclosure, my company wrote. But the deep retrofit is a building-specific whole building analysis designed to identify points in the building's life cycle where investments in energy efficiency can achieve the highest return, involving bigger measures such as all the windows, changing the heating and cooling loads, switching central building equipment to a different fuel source, etc. Deep retrofit may take a couple years and may require more significant financial commitment than a conventional retrofit, and can see energy retrofit savings greater than 40%. We have this little chart here, pay a little bit less reduction to exactly where each of these number lines fall, but the general point is that generally when we talk about basic retrofits, commissioning, lighting upgrades, controls and sensors, efficient plumbing, we're talking about savings in the sort of 10, 15% range, 20% maybe. When you start moving towards central mechanical plant, major upgrades, envelope upgrades, changing fuel systems, you can start to see really deep savings. And we've worked on buildings that are cutting their site energy use by 40%, 50%, 65%, and getting not exactly net zero energy, but heading in the sort of net zero energy ready direction. But again, these things take time, and so often can't be achieved within the 5-year cycle of BEPS, but but it's much more cost efficient to do this all now. If I do only my low-hanging fruit now, the life cycle cost analysis of those deeper upgrades is going to be much more difficult if I don't have those cheaper measures to balance it out basically and make the whole package be much more cost effective. So if all I do now is if every building only hits the 20% or only hits the standard target, it's going to be harder, especially the ones that do that 20% reduction, to do another 20% reduction down the line. It'd be much easier for me to take 7 years and or maybe wait 4 years till I'm time for a capital upgrade, and then do a deeper thing and go 40, 50%. And so the question is how to incentivize that, which gets to the discussion, which is next slide. So the deep retrofit discussion here is sort of two rule some real scenarios we talked about here: an early compliance incentive that would target deeper savings early in exchange for extended compliance, or an extended compliance period for a larger capital investment timeline targeting deeper savings. They're sort of different ways of sort of saying the same thing, I suppose. And then, so then sort of questions I think would be good for us to sort of discuss and open up for discussion is sort of, should we allow, another way to think about it, is, you say you got 40%, you go does that check for the next cycle? What is the threshold? 40% is the number I raised because that's what's in the plan, but, open to conversation. And then I think critically to any conversation about this has to be a question about how we address backsliding, because there's a big difference between doing an install and running it properly. So, and if we say you get 2 cycles to do it, and then it's 10 years till the district gets to say, hey, are you actually running that system properly? So these are the thoughts thrown out for group discussion.
And I'll also bring up, we have another slide.
Do we have another slide?
We do, for the deep retrofit planning. So this has been a huge topic of conversation
we do.
with the DOE, talking about this particular topic, because I think when this was first brought up, it was, I think it was Cliff's idea, talking about how do we incentivize early compliance? Like, how in year 1 or 2 do we incentivize people to think about deep retrofits? And do we sign off and say they're compliant, but then we're having these concerns about, well, what if they aren't getting the performance? They do the projects and then they aren't operating their building properly. And then every single time we've talked about it, we end up talking about, well, what if somebody came to us in year 4 or 5 and said, well, I want to do a deep energy retrofit, but I've run out of time, or I couldn't find the capital investment to do that. I need to do an extension. And those two are completely different scenarios that would be treated differently in the rules. One is an early compliance incentive, and one is a reason to do an extension, which may not have to be treated any differently in the rules, other than we've already got something written and we won't have to do anything different. So what we did was we put together
Thanks for clarifying that.
Yeah, sorry, because we had a huge amount of discussion around this at the DOE of these 2 different scenarios. So this first slide talks about the early compliance incentive. How do we get people to look at early compliance and do this in the first couple of years and target deep retrofits? But then there's concerns about backsliding, about performance, about not operating their building properly, that kind of thing, versus extensions for bigger capital planning and that kind of thing. So we could kind of tackle these as 2 completely different topics within the deep retrofit area, and we could start maybe with the early compliance one with these questions as a guidance for the discussion. We'll talk about early incentives.
This is Cliff.
Should we offer something? Go ahead, Cliff.
I think it's a really good summary. I think one area that I'm particularly concerned about is protecting affordable housing and making sure that, in the case of affordable housing, often they have very limited access to capital, and their only real access to significant capital with significant, with reasonably favorable terms, and their only access to staffing to really plan for a retrofit is the sort of once every 15 year when they're refinancing their mortgage and they're renewing their rental covenants. So I think that we need to be thinking about periods of compliance of at least 15 years, so that buildings can build it into a mortgage, a 15-year mortgage, and know that they won't have to make any more improvements until they have to refi again in another 15 years. I mean, we can have shorter options as well, but I do think we need to have that longer option, especially for affordable housing and other buildings that are putting it into a 15-year mortgage.
Well, and I think we were going to put things in the extension criteria to be able to address those We understood that from the NHT recommendations, and I think we talked a little bit about that earlier in some previous task force meetings. I don't think we have any issues with that because I think there's already some extensions already built in very specifically for that even go beyond the 3. So if you were going to do, so I think there's two different, if you're going to encourage these retrofits for, let's say, affordable housing, and their 15-year, let's say, cycle, or let's say a 10-year cycle on some other type of loans for some other type of property happened within the first couple of years of a BEPS compliance cycle, it might kind of qualify for this early compliance incentive type of idea. Otherwise, if it goes past the 5 years, they just ask for an extension. And on a case-by-case basis, we would probably grant it as long as we understood, they were able to prove that they were going through this process and, doing these deep, I don't think there's really a question there of being able to apply for an extension if they were needing extra time to be able to do the retrofit.
Mm-hmm.
I think we had more questions about this early compliance kind of idea that was brought up earlier in our task force meetings that we wanted to ask about.
And I think I'll just chime in there, Sharon, also, and say, I mean, this also goes to, I think, what Katie was talking about earlier about, like, what do we regulate versus what do we incentivize? And so you could easily get a 40% reduction and find yourself above the next median, and there's your incentive, versus should we guarantee that certainty that you are compliant for the next cycle in the rules?
And being able to guarantee that in the rules would would help with people getting financing to help fund this stuff and certainly incentivize it. Could you address the backsliding issue if you had a requirement that said, okay, if you can show a 40% savings within that first cycle, within a cycle, you can be compliant for the next cycle, so long as you also demonstrate that but you are required to at least do a retro commissioning during that following cycle. Like you have to budget for making sure that you're going to be doing something to keep your building up to snuff.
Yeah, well, the question is, are you basing that 40% off of what was modeled on the project versus how it's being operated or commissioned versus 2 years after the building is up and the project was done and commissioned and you had it? Like, where are you basing the 40%? Like, if you did an early compliance incentive and you're saying you're writing, because this person just invested $10 million in their building and they targeted 40% with the guarantee that they would be compliant for 2 cycles. When would you write them that letter? Would you write them like the day they finished the project but didn't have to show any performance because it was based on the modeling? Or would you have to have that in operation for a year and benchmarking data would have to show that the 40% was achieved? Or would you have to have 3 years after the project was installed and they were operating the building properly afterwards? Those are some of the questions we have. What would you base that off of?
I think that's a really hard question. This is Cliff. I think you could potentially have multiple options, but I think you want to incentivize people to use their actual performance as opposed to modeled performance.
Okay.
Recognizing that, in the case of like affordable housing, they only have sort of one bite at the apple. They refi once. They're going to have to, and if they underperform, you may have to cut them some slack, or maybe you can provide some assistance or something to help them. But they should have to at least have a pretty, model, let's say, 55% savings, or have measured 40% savings or something like that. And then that gives you some margin of safety that if they modeled it at 55, hopefully they've at least achieved 40.
Yeah, I would agree that energy models can be all over the place, and what you say you're going to get is not always what you get. And so I think if you're going to give an extension for a following cycle, it's got to be based on achieved savings, or now if you only finish it, I guess at the end of the 5 years, it's a little tricky, but ideally it should be based on achieved savings here.
Do you have any other
I think if you
thoughts?
finish it, well, I was just going to add to what Marshall said. If you finish it at the end of the 5 years, you could ask for the extension for 12 months in order to prove performance. But
Yeah.
I think generally we're talking about performance throughout, and so it should be based on performance and not modeled data.
Agreed.
This is Patty. I agree with that. Actual performance should be what is considered.
Yeah.
I would just point out that in many of the cases, the opportunity to do these sorts of big projects are going to be at a transaction or with a lot of vacancy. And so your ability to measure that performance may be quite a lag until that property is stabilized. It is rented back up. There's a fair baseline and performance period against which to measure. So I just want to put that out there, that there could be quite a delay before you get that actual performance data, in which case you're probably just into that third performance cycle at that point, or compliance cycle.
Well, the other question we had is hoping that they were going to target deep retrofits that put them above the median for the next cycle anyways, is it that they're above the median? Like, why, if we're talking about performance periods that are pretty far down the road because we're not quite sure exactly how long it may have to be, they might end up being above the median for the next cycle anyways. Do we need to even offer this, or how would we even offer this? I'm just trying to, and in a standardized way that makes sense for us to offer it.
Certainty is really important for a lot of building owners. So I don't think, I don't think it's enough to say, look, you're going to be well ahead of the median. Don't worry. In 5 years, we'll come out with a new median and you'll be good to go.
Great.
I really do think a lot of owners need that certainty, and we need to be able to provide them that certainty up front, especially for like affordable housing where they only have one bite at a 15-year financing apple. I think we need to be able to provide them 15 years of certainty.
I also think that
And
I would just
also
add,
to agree,
go ahead.
this is a little bit of an early adopter incentive, especially like for this first cycle. You know, a lot of the things that we're going to be asking people to do, if it's, you know, major envelope retrofits or electrification or things of that, these major deep energy retrofits haven't really been done a lot. So we're going to, I think, want to really incentivize it, and then to provide a little bit of forgiveness, just because, as other folks have mentioned, you know, there's a big discrepancy between modeled and actual, and there could be a lot of issues for the install or other problems that just are things that early adopters deal with.
Yeah, and that's why I think that a requirement that there be a sort of even if you are exempt from you're covered for 2 cycles, that you're going to come back and do a retro commissioning and a tune-up of the building is important. I would agree. I would also say there are buildings that are super poor performers who could get a 40% or a 50% reduction, and they would still probably be below the median. So, but they just nonetheless deserve that credit for doing that deep retrofit.
Todd or Jessica or Reshma, Adrian, I would love to hear your thoughts on this particular issue.
I agree that the 15-year compliance cycle, that's standard for low-income housing tax credit projects, and so I think it's appropriate to kind of think of at least that as a minimum time frame for affordable housing projects. And in terms of requirements changing, I mean, I agree that we need to, with Cliff, that there needs to be certainty and ability for the owner and the investors in the projects to be able to assess their risk and not have a sense that things are going to change mid-cycle.
What do you think about the performance side of it? Because I think that's one of the things that really concerns us the most, because this is a performance standard that you can, sit there and actually install a project, but then that doesn't mean that it's operated properly? How do you think we could address that if we did some of these long-term sign-offs?
That's a good
And
question.
anybody can chime in on that.
I'm wondering, specifically for affordable housing, it's probably worth looking at, right now the different green building standards, that certifications that projects pursue. The minimum right now, is Enterprise Green Communities or LEED Silver. And then, and I guess with those, are the projects, are they able to achieve a 40% improvement or not? I guess it'd be helpful to kind of maybe dive into the data. We have data available of seeing what projects are actually achieving right now to confirm if it's realistic or not, and if that's the right measure.
Yeah, well, and I think we're not just thinking about offering this just for affordable housing. We're talking about offering this to everybody.
Sure, yeah.
So, yeah.
This is Ace again. One of my bigger priorities is to try to look forward on the new construction side to really incentivize projects via like UIs or whatnot to have 2, 3, 4 cycles. Granted that, they do like some basic retro commissioning and making sure that their actual performance is relatively equivalent to their predictive. Just because in theory, if they're doing it right the first time and they're doing a really good mechanical systems on the new construction side, they should really be doing it right, and that's the time to do it. And it might also even provide additional value, on the actual value of the property side. If hopefully in a couple of cycles there becomes a defined value from the investment community on compliance versus non-compliance. So I'd love for us to be able to figure that out for some of the major space types.
This is Jay. I think that's a really good point, Asa. And then I think it's sort of the same issue with deep retrofits, and to Marshall's point, where a project that's performing really poorly could get 40% savings and still be below the median. I don't necessarily think that we should be incentivizing those projects. So for new construction or these really deep retrofit projects, maybe there's an EUI target consistent with Appendix C or something else in the code, or some other kind of very deliberate spelled out performance pathway for those projects that then gets them the relief 1, 2, or 3 cycles out as well.
Okay. I just realized that we are running out of time.
I was just thinking that.
We ran out of time. Well, to wrap up this conversation just for today, this is certainly not done. Is there anything that the group would like us to look at or to research or analyze to maybe bring more information to this particular discussion so that we can kind of revisit this at the next topic?
Well, I'll just say one thing. I think Asa's point was real, and Jay's points are really well taken, that there are buildings that will be able to do a deep retrofit without doing a major renovation, but most of a super deep retrofit is usually going to trigger building codes. So it would be interesting to have a conversation with DCRA and figure out how the compliance mechanisms that DCRA has in place could help inform how this is being measured and tracked. I think that would be, because I think these are usually going to be code triggering upgrades, and that may be a way, through there may be a way to have a better oversight on sort of what the energy model is projecting, and then also comparing to what the outcomes are.
Okay. We'll do a little bit more research on the topic and then bring it kind of back to the group. Any other thoughts from task force members of things that we can research or bring back to the group?
This is Cliff. I'm very concerned about affordable housing and the fact that they have these big 15-year windows. And I do think getting an early compliance option to them as quickly as possible, and then saying, look, we expect you to use this option. Otherwise, you're going to have to comply with the set cycle. You don't want a situation where a building is refinancing in 2021 or 2022, and then they say, oh, I need an extension to. We really need to target these affordable housing buildings that have upcoming mortgages and give them all the help that we can and help them to do deep retrofits with the benefit of the low-cost capital that they can get from that transaction. And every opportunity that we miss is going to have long-term implications in terms of locking us into a higher carbon path.
Mm-hmm.
Gotcha.
And just like another thing when it comes to the 15-year window, sometimes we go a few years out of the 15-year window. So I would just to kind of reiterate what saying that it's like a minimum of 15 years. Sometimes our refinances don't happen till years 16, 17, 18. So it could be a little longer than 15 years sometimes.
Sure. That makes sense. Thanks, Jessica.
I'd like to better understand, this is Reshma, with the 40% savings, like just thinking about other metrics, and how, like thinking about, I know affordable housing, but also more broadly, depending on what, like for example, if a project if they're choosing to pursue a certain type of certification, just how this 40% aligns with that or doesn't align, just trying to better understand. I don't know if we have data to look at examples of what projects.
I've run data on that for a confidential client. I'll see what I can get permission to share at a future meeting.
Great, that'd be helpful.
Yeah, I don't know if DOE may have. I don't know if we have the data to be able to fill that out, but we'll see.
I'll just spoil it and say, without sharing anything, that most of the basic certifications that buildings are doing, such as Enterprise Green Communities or LEED Silver, are not getting near this level of savings anywhere close. I'll just leave it at that, but we'll hopefully more soon.
Okay.
Annika has some good examples of projects she was involved in that saved more than 40%.
Oh, certainly. There are lots of projects doing it. I'm just saying the basic certifications are not getting there.
Yeah,
well,
I agree with that.
That's true.
Well, I think then I think going back to Cliff's point about there being more flexibility for affordable housing projects and other projects that have a shorter have a need for a longer compliance cycle because of the way they're structured.
Right. Thanks, Reshma.
This is Christian. Just to point out, those are all green rating systems, not energy rating systems. So a lot of projects in and around the district are getting a lot of points from, their accessibility to transportation and walking score and stuff that has nothing to do with energy. So I see a tremendous amount of projects that are getting LEED certified in the city for new construction or major retrofit that get at least 2/3 of their credits without even doing anything, just by existing in DC or doing like really basic industry standard stuff that they already do.
Mm-hmm.
Like
That's
low
fair.
VOC
That's a very
paints,
good point.
which are a no-cost option that everybody does. That gets you a point.
Yeah, that's a very good point, Christian. Thank you. Hey, Marshall.
I guess I'm the chair. I should wrap things up here. I'm just so intrigued by listening to all this conversation. It's so good.
Well, and Marshall, we can talk about. We had put together some slides from the bike rack on
which we will not be getting to.
Exactly, for historical districts, mixed-use properties, district energy systems, and solar installations, just to call them out since we put them on the agenda that we did not have time to get to, but we were just going to bring them back up. So we will just put them on a future agenda just to call those out. So we can review what's up for the next meeting and save a couple minutes for announcements.
Yeah. So next meeting, we'll talk about tradable allowances. We'll potentially continue this extended ACP conversation, and we'll talk about these various bike rack issues and draft outline of rules and penalty matrix. That's a lot for a 2-hour meeting. So we'll noodle on what we actually will get to. But
Exactly. We probably won't talk about these bike rack review issues at all. What we do definitely want to get to is tradable allowances. We have the stormwater folks from DOEE coming to do a presentation. So we know that's going to happen. We have that scheduled for April 28th. And we wanted to at least propose some ideas for a penalties matrix to get that conversation started, because we know that's going to take longer than one meeting. And then we'll probably, depending on the time, maybe have a second half of a deep retrofit conversation, depending on time, and then possibly draft outline of rules, that's a whole lot, but we will see. Draft outline of rules may end up being on May 12th. So we will kind of go from there.
Sharon, mind if I chime in quickly?
Yeah.
With the penalty matrix, this is sort of building off of a call for sort of people who have case studies in mind of buildings who have done major retrofits that have reached the BEPS compliance, and also sharing some cost data with us. I think I've only gotten one case study, so I will follow up with the private members of the task force to see if anyone else has any case studies in mind that they would be able to share.
Yep, I think we need a little bit more information. Yeah, we need a little bit more information before we can finish flexing out that the idea for the penalties matrix.
Could be useful. All
Yep.
right.
Does anybody
I'll
have
just
an
say that
announcement?
Yeah, I'll just invite that, I think the sooner we can get the draft outline of rules will be good. Yeah, any other announcements we have? I'll try. I'm going to say that I've been sending out a couple. Integral's been doing the series of IG Vision talks, and I've sent out a couple of them, and I don't want to keep bombarding you. So if people want to get on that listserv, just let me know, and then we can I can stop bombarding the whole list.
This is Cliff. I just want to quickly announce that the TC High Performance Building Hub has hired our director. It's Lindsay Falaska, who was already at IMT and actually had a leading role in developing the hub proposal that DOEE accepted. So there was a press release that went out about that last week, and we're very excited. Still, the hub will not be officially launching until the fall.
Yeah, Jay, do you want to?
Yeah, I was going to say, this is Jay. Similarly, the DC Green Bank has hired the CEO, Eli Hobson, who started on Monday. And so it's very exciting that those initiatives are moving forward.
Yay.
Yay.
Do we have any other
announcements?
Oh, okay, then I'm going to officially stop the recording at 4:41. Thank you, everyone.